was told, always make sure that you're telling people you're going to record them. And so,
well, yeah, and you didn't have your assistant call me to confirm through my agent that we actually have all the paperwork covered for today's call. So I just assume that's happening between our people are talking to each other at this point. This is a prove it call, not a dRofus call. So it's all about Brok. So I thought I would represent. I wore my Georgia red. There's a lot of conflict in the news right now as far as should we play or should we not. Yeah. I have chosen not to play this year. I've chosen to stay indoors to try to keep my socially distanced behavior to myself. But in spirit, my sister and I thought, if there's no football season, I don't know. Are you a big football fan out in Nebraska? Do they have a team?
I'm not. I'm an oddball here in Nebraska. I never got into the Big Red sort of fandom that exists here. I mean, it's very prevalent. I mean, that's people live and die by Nebraska football.
I heard somewhere that on Saturday it's the largest city gathering in the state or something like that. I may be saying that wrong.
No, yeah. So when the stadium fills up in Lincoln, it's the third largest city in the state.
It's a big deal. That's a big deal. I know for my family.
But let's. I need to temper that. The bar in Nebraska is set very low when it comes to population size. So that's it's relative to Nebraska. That's a big deal.
There's several things that you can do in Nebraska, and they're probably not very different than what we can do in Georgia. And having the University of Georgia and having Nebraska football as the things that we do in our various states, and honestly, it keeps us a lot out of trouble or in trouble. It depends on your level of quality team and how much you actually care about the sport. But I'm a huge football fan. I went to most games that I could last year. Went to the Rose Bowl when Georgia went to the Rose Bowl. It was easier because I lived in California. It would be harder now that I live in Athens to kind of make that game. But the truth is, I think we all are looking for some outlet, and sports has been something that we're all looking forward to some degree as an outlet of normalcy. Yeah. And what my sister and I are going to be doing, because we're anticipating there's not going to be any season, is we're coming up with the top 10 Georgia greatest games in history, and we're going to put together our own schedule, and we're going to say, okay, next Saturday at 3:00 kickoff, it's going to be this game from 2000 whatever, and we're going to just simulcast, hit the play button on our 2 YouTube channels, and basically act like we're at the game. We're going to FaceTime each other. And, it's like some
commentary and do some. Are you going to live stream it? You should live stream it.
There's some legal issues related to broadcasting, and with my 500,000 followers, I would get an invoice from CBS, and I don't want that necessarily to happen. But I don't know. I might text Kirby and see if he's able to join me socially distanced in the living room or outside, and see if he wants to throw in a few tidbits of particular advice he would give to certain players in certain conditions. We'll see how that goes. I'm working on the schedule first. To me, that's the primary thing.
Yeah. No, I've heard of folks here in Nebraska, looking to do something similar. Since I don't know what the story is fully when it comes to the state of Nebraska football, but the Big Ten has canceled the season, and that has created an uproar in the community here that wanted to see Nebraska football play, and me being completely indifferent to the whole situation and kind of looking at it from a distance. And they're like, well, why don't you play for yourself games when Nebraska was actually a winning team? This is how, by the way, I alienate everyone that may be watching this podcast from Nebraska.
They instantly stopped at minute 3.
I can just see the viewing stats on YouTube now, and just see you know, the 5 people from my community here that actually tuned in just drop off.
Nate, that was clever. How quickly you turned our conversation from sports to data. I saw what you did there.
Oh yeah,
I saw how you worked that.
The flip of the switch into like, hey, we're going to talk big data analytics now, and talk a bit about trend lines and.
Yeah, if you could take that data, put it into Tracer, then we can actually compare that to where you viewed those statistics and what part of the country. That would be interesting to slice it up. No, but the truth is, I think the sporting aspect of what people are wanting is part of the, you know, we're sheltered in place. We are unable to go outside. When we do go outside, we're wearing weird things on our faces to protect ourselves. But the greatest thing that I have learned in this whole experience is how much it's more important to know how to do this, right? Yeah. We're all picking up this skill set of an hour call used to be a big deal. Now it's like, I only spent 7 hours on Zoom this week. You know, it becomes a scale of projection. And I think we're all picking up skills. We're learning how to look at the camera instead of looking at the screen. You know, how many times have you been on a call with a guy and you're like, we're over here, you know, but we're learning that skill by force. And I think a lot of our industry learns through having to be forced into a process. We're not really the industry that says, you know, let's actually think about this totally different. Now, there are some outliners, and they're mostly the people that you and I know through social gatherings and networking events and so forth. There's the fringe group, but there's a specific value of our industry learning through challenges that I think we will come out stronger in the end, because we will have had time to pick up some skills, watch a few YouTube videos. I know people that are learning tools that they didn't have time to learn before. So I think there's actually going to be some positive traction from this and more people able to do more.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of change that, I mean, you said, you're spot on. Like, change in the architecture and construction industry does not happen overnight. It happens in very slow, kind of incremental shifts to how people might work and leverage different technology or working processes, establishing new roles. But you know, the way that I saw firms respond to the pandemic back in March, and being able to see large organizations, almost some of them struggled for sure. Others were able to almost seemingly flip a switch and be like, okay, we've actually been preparing our virtualization strategy for a couple of years now, and now just putting more urgency behind it. So we're going to deliver it over the next week. So it you know, there's that meme that went around, you know, who was responsible for your digital transformation? Was it your CEO, your CTO, or was it COVID-19? And I think we saw the answer to that.
Even if you go back 20 years, Photoshop was introduced into architectural design firms because a student who had a seat of Photoshop, license or not, learned it, brought it into the firm, right?
Yeah.
A few years later, you start seeing Form Z, you start seeing some of these interesting modeling tools. And I think it's that generation that we're always going to look to. We're always going to look to that late teens, early 20s group to say, why not? Why can't we use this thing called Blender? Why can't we explore using open IFC formatting? Or you know, can we actually look at data differently? And I'm seeing that because I virtually saw the AEC hackathon a few weeks ago, and the idea of innovation, you didn't see that with guys our age so much. And I think as long as we're throwing fuel on the fire to that generation and offering them the opportunities, like, for example, just to shout out to you guys a little bit with your internship program, I feel like what you guys do with your interns adds value to the industry because you're bringing them into the fold. They're learning something very quickly, targeted, and a skill that they can actually use when they go back to school or when they actually go into the workforce. And I feel like right now there is a huge pool of available resources of young professionals that are hungry to learn, hungry to dive into using tools and using technology. And honestly, there's not a lot of construction. There's not a lot of CA administration requirements right now. But innovation, there's a huge amount of opportunity with innovation right now.
That's, no doubt about it. And I think with that point, I'm going to segue into maybe the actual part of this conversation. You've already kind of kicked it off, and I think set the stage really well. And people are probably, if people are tuning into the Proving Ground YouTube channel and being like, hey, what's the next Prove It podcast all about? They're probably wondering, why is this bald guy talking to this bearded guy?
It's the inverse of hair ratio, right?
Yeah. And what is the, what's this conversation all about? So
yeah,
a couple of weeks back, you and I connected. We've known each other for a number of years now. This is Brok Howard from dRofus, technical account manager. You do a lot of training, implementation, helping your customers figure out how to use your platform, which we can certainly talk about in some detail if you'd like, and talk about how you ended up in the world of technology, which is in architectural technology. That's usually my favorite topic to like talk to people about. Is
sure,
okay, out of all possibilities, why did you end up in A, architecture, but then B, technology and architecture? And that's usually always an interesting story to hear. And I think you've kind of started to get into this with your narrative there about equipping people with processes and the ability to kind of explore and learn. Younger folks having perhaps a different type of insight into the process, and ask questions like, why don't we do it this way as opposed to the way that we've always done it? So I'd like for you to rewind the clock a little bit and talk a bit about what gravitated you to architecture and the space of construction first. Maybe we can start there and work our way to the state.
Brok pre-beard is where we'll go, and we'll end with why I grew a beard. And we can round it out from beard to beard.
We could, like, the length of the podcast can be the equivalent to the length of your beard.
Yeah,
like sort of
you can overlay some graphics of a timeline. That would be great. That way people can fast forward and jump ahead. To be honest, the notion of my history is very much rooted with where I live today. So we can actually go back about 20 years. So when I was 4 years old, so 20 years ago, I was at a threshold in my life, a transition point that a lot of people are that are graduating, that are thinking about what they want to do with their careers. And I essentially started my whole exploration into architecture even earlier. We can actually go back to when I was probably 16. You're cutting grass in Georgia in the summer, and you think to yourself, there's got to be a better way to make a few dollars as a teenager. So I asked my parents, do you know anybody that has a job that I can do? I just need to make a few dollars to put gas in the car, that kind of thing. And a friend of mine, who eventually became a friend of my parents, offered me my first real job, the job that you did not get paid in cash, but actually got a check with taxes taken out, which to me signifies the real first job, because you calculate your hourly and you're like, why isn't this coming out right? And you learn the whole, what it means to actually get net and gross. It's a great experience to have when you're 16. But John Gramigna Architects offered me my first real job, and it was an air-conditioned job, which was already a step up from working outside cutting grass. And my main responsibility that summer, the very first summer, was organization in the architecture office. They weren't prepared to put me in front of a computer. I wasn't thinking about drawings or picking at red lines. It was literally, we just need you to help organize the office. So if you guys are a fan of Arc Record, my responsibility was on a weekly basis to go to the architect's desks and say, are you done with this one? And then put it in chronological order where it actually was on the shelf of all of the ARC records. And for those of you that realize there was an era before the internet, this is how you did research about precedent or researching details or trying to get inspiration. You would flip through what we called magazines, and those magazines would have glossy pictures that were taken with film and then published into these books. So my only job that summer was taking those magazines and putting them away. And you know what I did? I flipped through those magazines as I was taking them from the architects' desks and putting them onto the shelf. And so the beginning of, wow, maybe I could do architecture. Maybe this is something that actually might be of interest to me. And I asked to get more involved. And they said, well, okay, why don't you scan these Mylar drawings into our brand new scanner so that we can digitize them. And so now I'm going from inspirational magazines to actually looking at these drawings, and scanners at that time weren't very fast. So there was plenty of time for while the computer was collecting those pixels across the Mylar. I was actually looking at these drawings and getting an understanding of what it means to draw on the top side of the Mylar versus post-shading on the bottom side of the Mylar to create the depth in the drawings. And I've developed an appreciation for quality of work and penmanship and lettering. We actually hand lettered every single thing on those drawings. So the next summer, I asked John, I said, I appreciate the job. I can only do so much of a librarian shelf mode and scanning kind of mode. Can I do more? And he said, well, you know, why don't you sit over there and I'll show you a few things. So I was introduced at 17 years old to AutoCAD and a digitizer and the green screen of AutoCAD at that time, where everything was command driven. Drawing a line actually meant, you know, typing in line in quadrants and percentage of angle and so forth to get that curve. And so it was a painful introduction to AutoCAD compared to those of you that might be starting off with Revit with all of these fancy plugins. But the digitizer was good for me because you lift up the plastic screen and you put in a hand drawing from a professional. So the architects that were down the hall for me would hand draw a 1/4 inch scale details. I would then overlay or underlay them into the digitizer, and I would literally trace them with this digitizer that had 12 action buttons into it. And so I got to see the action of doing something over here with my hand while looking at the screen. So you're learning a skill there. You're learning the ability to connect your eyes without your hands to this computer, and also learning about detailing and understanding that that scribble of the architect's hand needed to turn into clear font. And so that firm was transitioning from a hand drawing process to a digital process. And I started to love it even more. I realized when I got to see things come to life and I got the chance to go to my first construction site visit and actually see the thing that I drew last summer is actually being built this summer. So those 3 summers was a huge impact on my life, a notion, an introduction to architecture. So your very next step is you apply to college. So you would naturally think, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm interested in architecture. I would go to Georgia Tech, one of the renowned, one of the best architecture schools in the country. I'm already a local Georgian, so I have the local aspect behind it. There's this thing, the Hope Scholarship. As long as you maintain a B average, you can go to college at a huge discount because the books are taken care of and all of that. But I don't even apply to Georgia Tech. I apply to Georgia. So I go off to college and I instantly become a college student. And what that means is that school is like
had you at that point just decided your major, where you're like, I'm doing architecture, or were you still figuring that? You're like, because you had this experience in your teens,
you would think,
but you hadn't yet made the connection that, hey, maybe I should major in architecture. You went in, you became full on college student, figuring your way out, getting into life. College.
Well, you have to remember, 18-year-old remember when you were 18, you're not necessarily making the best judgment decisions on a career path. You're not necessarily making the decisions of what your degree would be as it equates to your income, as it equates to your longevity with 401k planning and those kinds of things. I chose college because that's where my friends were going. That's where my sister was at. That's where my network was already. And I went to college and I went to college. I did not go to class. I did not study. I was a horrible student. I didn't take anything that John was teaching me about responsibility and about, learning new tools. I threw all of that out and focused on just entertaining myself as a college student, learning what it means to live out on my own, played a lot of volleyball, and eventually was asked by the University of Georgia to leave. There's this minimum grade point average thing that many of you 18-year-olds should actually understand when it comes to scholarships. And I ended up actually having to go to a secondary school. I ended up going to a smaller architectural school because that summer I sat down with John and he's like, "What are you doing at Georgia?" I said, "It's a great college." He's like, "But what are you doing at Georgia? What are you studying? What are you trying to focus on?" Because he knew that there was no architecture program there. And so I said, okay, let me just try architecture. So I went to a smaller school, Southern Polytechnic State University. It's in Marietta, Georgia. It's actually changed names to be part of Kennesaw University now. And I got reintroduced to architecture a couple years into college. Studio was the big thing that shocked me. Whoa. Taking all of this nighttime college activity that I did in my early college days and exchanging that for spending time with about a dozen people my age, focusing on drawings and modeling. And it only took one semester for me to see a hand injury at 2 o'clock in the morning to have my feelings about, man, this is going to be tough. Do I really want to do this? Is this the profession that I want to do? So I got serious about it. I said, you know what? I need to go to a good university. This is an okay university, but I need to up my university game. I applied to Iowa State. Of all places, I said, you know what? I'm still too close to home. Marietta in Atlanta is just still too close. I really need to move.
Yeah.
So I move all the way to Des Moines, Iowa, knowing that I'm going to be going to Ames the following semester for school. I get introduced to the Midwest winter that you are intimately familiar with versus the Southern heat. Instantly start to build a thicker skin because if you know anything about shoveling snow in Iowa, you shovel the driveway and by the time you're done, you need to start over again because it continues to come down. So I learned when I moved to Iowa what it means to hold up 3 jobs, pay your own way going to college, getting rejected by Iowa State's architecture program every single semester, but I got accepted to the school. So I spent several years getting a degree and never getting into the architecture program. I learned when I graduated.
What was your degree?
I got a bachelor's in liberal studies. So okay. I call that a professionally undecided student because between Georgia, Southern Poly, and Iowa State, I actually had I think 2/3 of a degree. So I had so many credits between taking art history and business classes at Georgia and math classes at Southern Poly. I had basically decided, let me just graduate as fast as possible and go to graduate school. I clearly wasn't getting accepted to Iowa State. I learned later when I graduated, it was because they did not like transfer students. Maybe that's changed.
Yeah, I wonder if that's changed.
There was a stigma that we can't teach you because you didn't start here in our pedagogy of architecture. You were tainted. But ironically, as a graduate of Iowa State, not in their architecture program.
That's so strange to me. And I do see that in different university systems for sure.
Sure.
And, to some degree, there's like if you make your culture so impenetrable that you're not able to allow outsiders in, that to me starts to suggest that your culture has become stagnant. And Iowa
Sure.
State has made some amazing strides. We had Shelby Doyle on, and last year on doing an interview. She teaches their digital fabrication lab
Sure.
there in Iowa State. Steve Sanda is on our team, Iowa State architecture grad, and from everything I've heard, is that they're that this is persistent. I think it's not just one college, but the idea that you need to allow your culture to be influenced by outsiders
here's the ironic thing about that culture. When I graduated from Iowa State, they insisted I apply to graduate school. So they want their graduate students, their teaching assistants, to actually be from outside the school. So they actually want that mix of external influence at the graduate school level. But I tell you, Iowa State was an amazing school. I got to experience all of the architecture classes minus studio, because I knew that if I ever got accepted, all I would need to do was studio. You can take art history and you can take all those prerequisite courses without being in the program. So I was actually on track minus the studios. But then imagine you're about to graduate and all that's left is studio. That would be kind of a perfect, right? All you're doing
you're about to get you're going to have your worst set of semesters ever, to catch up on studio. Can you imagine doing this clearly wouldn't be allowed, but like doing more than one studio at once to like try to catch up? That would be
imagine doing an undergrad studio and a graduate studio at the same time. I mean,
I'm sure there's someone out there that's doing it, and someone that's doing it and they love it,
right?
Gluttons for punishment. But that scenario is that's pretty daunting. That's a pretty daunting scenario. Like, it's different when it's like when you're doing it on the normal path. That's like you're the frog in the slow boiling water, as opposed to kind of the path that you were on, just jumping into the boiling pot, which either way you're going to have a bad time.
True.
In one case it's a little more shocking.
The engineering school clearly had more money when I was there, so I also took classes at the engineering school. I took a few computer science classes, and I kind of explored a little bit down that realm. And they had what was called V6. It was a virtual environment that you would get in. It was a cube, 6-sided cube, and it was projected cameras. And they would have companies like John Deere would come in, and they would have a John Deere seat, but then they would virtually mock up the entire system. So when they pulled a lever, this thing on the screen would show them lifting this thing. And when they would drive the tractor, they could virtually test it. And I actually got to take my model that I modeled in Form Z and bring it into their V6 system, because I was a hybrid student, because I had access to the engineering school and I was taking some of these computer classes in the architecture school. I got to see my design in VR on the cutting edge of that technology, but before the headsets, and it was just kind of the cube kind of environment. And I can't help but think that kept me motivated to stay into architecture, to kind of also be tied into the technology realm of things. So I owe a lot to Iowa State from an experience standpoint. Working full-time was really tough as well. I worked at UPS loading boxes in the wee early morning hours. I worked at a men's clothing store. Selling, it was a clothier to be exact, selling tailored suits and bow ties and those kind of things. And I also had a night gig working at an architecture firm. So I found that
a night gig at an architecture firm. So we know that business hours in our industry are not necessarily 9 to 5, but what were your specific responsibilities in this scenario?
It's a great hustle. So for those of you that are looking for work, this is a good hustle. The architecture firm was still 9 to 5. I came in at the end of my clothing job. So the clothing store closed up about 6 o'clock, which is what you do in small towns. Businesses actually closed at 6.
That's right.
6 o'clock, I would go to the architecture firm and I would meet with each of the head architects. I had about we call those stand-up meetings now, right? I had a quick meeting with each one of them, and they basically had on their desk drawings with red lines. And they said, this is what I need picked up. Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. Go talk to Sarah. Talk to Sarah. She shows me what she needs. I talked to all the architects. They all leave around 6:30 or so because they have completed their day. And then I would sit at each of their desks using their computers, and I would pick up all their red lines, and I would highlight their red lines. And then I'd go to the next desk, and I would pick up all those red lines. So I used their hardware, their mouse, their computer, their drawing layout, and picked up their drawing. So they would come in the next morning with all of the red lines picked up. They called me the CAD fairy because they would redline, go home, come back, and all of their drawings will have been picked up with all of those markups. Magic. And it paid well because they didn't have to worry about the hardware, the office space, where I was going to sit. They literally just paid for my labor. And they're willing to pay more when it's just the labor costs, because guess what they did? They would end up billing my hours at the architect's rates because it was the same work that the architects were going to do. So think of me as a college student billing out at an architect's job, because now that architect's billing, instead of their 8 hours, they're billing 14 hours that day.
Wow.
So
that is a hustle.
It was a hustle. And when I would finish the architecture job around midnight, I would go home, change clothes, and sleep for about 3.5, 4 hours, then go to UPS and work at UPS from 2 till about 8 in the morning. And then I would take about an 1.5 hour nap and then go to class all day, and then go back to the job working at John Huber Clothier. So what that time at Iowa State taught me was how to hustle. It taught me how to stay organized. It taught me how to fund my own life, paying for rent, paying for your car, paying for gas, finding an opportunity to take a girl out to dinner every now and then when I had the opportunity to. But it also taught me the portion that worked at the clothing store. It taught me about sales. It taught me about how to treat customers. It taught me how to take care of people that you don't know what they're going to buy. I had a guy come in, he had stains on his shoes. He had holes in his jeans, and he had some grass stains on his shirt. He came in wanting to get some custom suits made.
Yeah.
I treated him like he was my best customer. Took super good care of him, measured him up, got him some custom suits, got him some custom shirts, got the initials made in all of the sleeves and all of the ties and so forth. My boss was sitting in the back of the room just kind of watching to see how this was going to go. Huge sale. I mean, a massive sale. He leaves. My boss calls me over and he goes, "Did you know that that's the president of the university?"
Yeah.
He had his day off. So he cut his grass.
Right.
And when he was done cutting grass, he went to John Huber to get what he needed for the school year that year. New suits, new ties, and everything. And I had no idea that it was literally in Ames, Iowa, probably the most important person in that town. And it taught me a lot about that whole experience of sales and taking care of people. So,
that's amazing. And you know, that very much mirrors exactly. I worked retail as well. I also worked in food service for doing pizza,
Sure.
And when you're on those kinds of front lines of dealing with customers and working with at a very basic level, you're trying to. I worked at Blick Art Supplies when I was in college, so that was
a great job.
So you would get these people coming in. Not, some people knew exactly what they wanted and you just needed to help them find it. Some people were like, I'm getting into painting for the first time. What do I, and you're then having to work with them to figure out where they should start,
Sure.
and what they should buy, and you figure out, what kind of art do you like along the way, and oh, well, you need to, get this brand of oil paint, and you should really be, getting a variety of these brushes. This is
Right.
what you're going to need to prepare your canvas. Then you'd have architecture students coming in. Some of my colleagues when I was in school at the time would be coming in and buying their balsa wood and all this stuff, and you're figuring out what they're doing. And it all comes back to this idea that someone's coming in with a problem.
Right.
And in your case, it's someone needs some new suits.
Needs assessment. Yeah.
And you need to assess what they need, and then you're delivering them solutions, which brings us all the way back to almost what we're doing today. In some respects, you're doing it at dRofus, where you're identifying what your customers need, and you're figuring out how can your solution figure that out. From our end, it's the consulting end of things, which is like it's problem solution all day. And it's those sort of those formative years really are the if you're doing those various hustles,
right,
you're figuring that out. School's not teaching you that.
I hadn't even finished school yet.
Yeah, you're right. And those life experiences are really is going to, really do determine. And what I like about your story is that you're actually from all the way back when you're in high school and you're kind of doing this gig with the architecture firm. You're also like, technology is always kind of a part of this conversation. You were part of like the kind of the early digitization of drawing for this. How big was that firm, by the way, that you were working for? Was it like a small firm, medium-sized firm?
John Kermigna was probably 8 or 10 architects. The firm that I worked for in Des Moines and in Ames, I worked at 2 different architecture firms. They were probably all around 10 to 30 architects. So in today's standards, those are almost single practitioner boutique, tiny firms. But in both cases, innovative in their own way, thinking of paper to digital. In 1997 was pretty innovative. The firm that I did the CAD Ferry work for, to be willing to give that level of responsibility without oversight, to me is another level of trust. I mean, to me, innovation is part technology, but also innovation is letting your team do their job and actually not micromanage, and let them loose and let them explore and figure it out, and then monitor their work. And if the work is good, let them keep going. Yeah. And it's a different level of innovation, I think. But yeah, this was all, fast forwarding ahead, this was all non-architecture degree-based education, because you can actually learn a lot by doing a job than what you can learn in school. And I know that school will say, you're not here to learn architecture, you're learn how to think, you're here to learn how to develop a process. But I actually do think that those formative years of learning how to use the computer, when I eventually did apply to graduate school at WashU, I was actually ahead of a lot of the students because I came in with computer skills. I actually understood enough about AutoCAD that when I picked up Vectorworks to do some 3D modeling, it was actually easy for me. And then I picked up Rhino. Can I tell you my Rhino story? This is one of my favorites.
Sure, let's hear your Rhino story. I love a good Rhino story.
So everyone's got a how they learned Rhino kind of story. And
I'll tell you mine afterwards.
Perfect. At Washington University in St. Louis, School of Design and Graphic, blah, blah, blah. The school was an architecture school, a graduate school, and they were going through a transitional period where there wasn't a lot of money coming in because there was a lot of money going to other departments. The art school was actually planning on doing a new building. So eventually architecture was going to get their time. And if you've been to St. Louis lately, you can see the architecture school has finally gotten their They were patiently waiting for an immaculate building. I think Carpenter was involved in that one. So it's an amazing project. But when I was there in my early graduate school years, the computer lab was actually a trailer at the end of the art school's construction site, because the future home of that lab was going to be in the basement of the new museum. So museums up here, the labs were going to be underneath. So they always knew they were going to build this computer lab, but the computer lab was in a trailer, HVAC, key lock, you know, real old school. And one of the jobs you always want in graduate school is a job in the lab. I had the job in the 3D printer lab, the laser cut lab, and the computer lab. So that means that you get to spend no money on the 3D printing, no money on the laser cutting, and you had access to the computer lab. And while you were working, you were getting paid. It's the perfect graduate student job, to find a place that you can be getting paid to watch other students, to manage the other students, and actually get your own work done. So I had a project where I needed to do a hand drawing Mylar representation perspective that was from my model. So what they were teaching you is to form by model, and then put it on your desk or put it on a pedestal, and then draw what you see in projections, you know, with your pencil construction lines and your ink drawings and so forth. And I was like, forget this. Why would I waste time hand drawing when I have all of these skills and all of these computer tools around me? So I took this chipboard model, which was crazy complicated with its geometry. I think it was all triangles. So imagine an entire building that's all triangles.
Like a faceted fractal type of.
Yeah, you know when you score a chipboard and then you fold it and you score it again, you fold it. It was a lot of that folding of chipboard. I took that model, I went to the computer lab, and I was looking for the AutoCAD software. And then I started to draw this in AutoCAD, and I'm like, wait, what is this black animal-looking thing, icon that looks like is that a rhino? Yeah, it's called rhinoceros. Okay, what is this? So I double-click on that software and get introduced to a whole new world. It starts off in a projection plane. And you already know it's cool because you're already in a projected plane. There's a 2D view and a 3D view and then another view, and you're like, okay, how do I work here? So I start with 2D, and I realize it's showing up in the 3D. So I pull this little green arrow in one direction and this other red arrow in another direction, and I'm starting to get planes. And I'm like, I wonder if I can do the whole thing in 3D. So I close the 2D view. I'm only in a 3D view. And I literally build the entire chipboard model nonstop for 12 hours. I never leave the computer lab. It was just, I got so into the model, and I had my little scale, and I was measuring it, and I was checking dimensions in the model, and I was color coding it, and I realized that I could actually change thicknesses, and I was learning extrusions on the fly. No YouTube, no person teaching me.
Yeah.
I literally was using my command-centric skills from AutoCAD to discover all of these features.
It's so transferable. Like, and this is what I tell people when they're picking up Rhino for the first time is like, well, you used AutoCAD, right? And they're like, oh yeah. So think about it like AutoCAD at first. You're going to have a command line. You're going to have these buttons. But
I get chills.
You're going to be able to do so much more. But for me, Rhino was, I did a little Rhino in college. Like I studied abroad. My first exposure to it was I went to London as part of the University of Nebraska's one of their foreign programs. You know, we could study overseas, study abroad programs. And I had a professor say, oh, well, if you're going to be in London, spend some time at the Architecture Association.
Sure.
And the AA. And sure enough, I did. And I saw like all their work. I kept seeing all these like mathematically generated forms, and people, you know, it was like that era where it was really popular to print out your script and put it on your board. Like
Right.
it's so in retrospect and thinking about it now, it's like so cheesy. It's like, why would you even print out your code and put it on your presentation board? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But I saw all this stuff and I'm like, what are they doing this in? And sure enough, it was all Rhino and Rhino script. So I'm like, I
Nice.
need to learn this program. I did like a small studio project with it, just bare minimum learning NURBS. But I was a Studio Max person. I loved,
Oh,
3D
sure.
Studio Max and kind of
The
working with
Z.
meshes. And yeah, I was all about Studio Max. So that was my primary tool all through undergrad and grad school.
Did you ever
Um,
explore Maya, or did you just stay in 3D Max?
no, I didn't ever get into Maya. It wasn't really a part of the university's, like, or really advertised and talked about really as this package that you could download and
Sure. It
install.
wasn't an
Studio
Autodesk
Max was like kind of
product.
a standard like student install.
Sure.
So I started applying for jobs out of grad school in Los Angeles, and
Nice.
because a couple of professors gave me a kick in the butt. They're like, you got to get out of here, yeah, get out of Nebraska for a while. And so I started applying around, and everyone kept asking, well, did you know Rhino? And I'm like, I had like the bare minimum knowledge. Maybe I used it one time, and I was like,
You
oh
knew
yeah,
what it was. You know how to
yeah,
answer.
I knew what it was. That was enough, and I was able to say like, yeah, I know Rhino. I know Rhino really well. So I'm like, saying like, yeah, totally, I can totally get it. So graduation happens. I move out to Los Angeles with my now wife, and 2 weeks before the job starts, I sit down and I crunch through some like stuff in Rhino. I think I did like a design competition, an
Yeah.
idea competition. It was like one of those like below ones, and I learned all of this stuff, and I came into the job, and I'm like, yeah, let's do some Rhino, and
Yeah.
it was and I had, in that short period of time, had picked up on enough to where I was like doing stuff that people that had more experience perhaps with Rhino didn't quite know how to do, because I was kind of coming at the program fresh, and other
Sure.
people had like, kind of used it for certain things. But yeah, it was fun. It was like, it was totally a fake it till you make it type of scenario. And that's what I love about Rhino, is that you can do a bit of fake it till you make it with that program. Like, you
Of
just
course.
like what you did. You picked it up and you started
Well,
crunching through some geometry.
the requirement for that studio was a hand drawing, right?
Yeah.
So I've got the Rhino model, and I got it built. And now I'm trying to think, well, how can I turn this into my hand drawing? And because of my AutoCAD skills, I learned that you can export views out of Rhino to DWG. So I would set up my perspective view, export that to CAD. Then I did all my line weights in AutoCAD. And a buddy of mine had his own printer at his house that he bought from his old architecture firm. So I printed super, super thin lightweights onto the Mylar drawing, and then took my pencil and did all my construction lines on top of the print, and then broke out my ink pens and drew the ink pen final finish on it. I basically traced my own work to produce a hand drawing. And of course, my professor's like, these are the best 3D projections I have ever seen. They're exactly like what you modeled. And I never confessed, because again, I was still hustling from my Iowa State days. It was like, yeah, let me just get through this studio as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And that's probably the first, maybe it was the second semester of graduate school. And I just hustled through all of graduate school with the same workflow. I 3D printed everything. I laser cut everything. The stool that I made in the woodworking course, where they're trying to teach you how to like sand, and there's a welding course. I 3D printed the mock-up, which was about an inch tall, of the stool that I was going to make, so I could study it. And then I laser cut quarter-inch, maybe it's eighth-inch thick pieces of wood of sections of my 3D model, and then laminated my entire stool in using just glue and laser cutter. And the woodworking guy wanted to fail me, but I said, you never said I had to use the tools that were in here. I was like a lawyer logistically arguing that you said it had to be made out of wood and all I could use was glue. I think I did that.
Yeah. That's like, that's problem solving right there. I mean, it's kind of like, hey, here are your constraints, and then you really had very few, and
right.
you did what you needed to do to solve the problem. And I always like, there's in software development, the folks that are always going to, they're going to look at the problem constraints. I really like computer programmers that can just look at the constraints, and if they're like programmers that want to save themselves some time and they want to find just efficient ways of doing it, they're going to find those tools, those algorithms, those pieces of technology they can pick up, and not try to reinvent the wheel. They're going to they're going to get to the end goal. So let's get into what you're currently doing. And so you went through this educational experience. You worked for architects. You spent a number of years at HOK doing their design technology work there. You were a specialist,
right?
In that sense, and then you then, I think at some point you probably made this decision to say, you know what, I have all of this experience. I've had this lineage of experiences with technology to do problem solving. And now you're at a product company. You're working at dRofus. You have this architecture background, and now you're really focused on this platform. So talk a little bit about what that looked like. How did you end up at dRofus?
Sure.
And yeah.
I've been a dRofus user for almost 10 years, but I've been working for dRofus for the last 5 in September. So when I was at HOK, I joined HOK in the last recession. So when everyone was getting laid off, I was recruited to join HOK, specifically in the interiors practice, which I honestly think every architect should spend time in both the interiors group as well as working on the exterior of architecture.
Yeah.
Because when I joined HOK in the interiors group, it was very much still a 2D practice. And in a very short time, by being a part of that team, my behavior and some of the things that were important to me helped influence the interiors group to be using Revit and a few other 3D kind of workflows. And it was while I was in that interiors group that dRofus was being piloted. So Greg Schleusner, very much responsible for bringing dRofus into HOK as an experiment, approached the interiors group and said, hey, we've got this new tool. We'd like you to explore it. It does a lot of stuff with rooms. You guys do a lot of things with rooms. And it was actually a GSA project, 400,000 square foot interiors project. So it was one of the largest interiors projects that office had ever seen. But Amy Rowbottom, who was the head project manager on that, was like, that's a perfect project for Brok. So I was able to learn interiors at HOK and a 400,000 square foot interiors project, which if you've ever done a GSA project, it's really a project with a bunch of tenants because each of the agencies are actually subleasing from the GSA. So part of it's one government agency, part of it's another government agency. They all have different budgets. They all have different finishes. So you're really talking about a 400,000 square foot project is really like a dozen good size projects, a 50,000 square foot interior projects. And using a database to organize that was new to me. It was a brand new version of software for me. It was all data driven, nothing like Rhino, nothing like Revit. At that time, there was no Revit integration. It literally was the first kind of packaged version for the United States, kind of on a consumption level of this product. And if you guys know Greg, you know he's very forward thinking. We would always say that it has to go through Greg before it ever goes into HOK. He was the gatekeeper of all technology. And Greg said, let's try this out. I started to experiment with it. I seemed to find some good traction in it. We seemed to be solving a lot of problems through it. And in that year process of working on that project, I was asked to take on the BIM management role for the office. So they saw what I was doing technology-wise in the interiors group, and they said, hey, we'd like you to do this for the whole office. That's when I get introduced to 30 additional plugins that HOK was using, and introduced to a lot of different processes of how do you take a Rhino model and get it into Revit? And we're trying to figure out these different workflows of meshes and so forth. And I then got introduced to all the big problems that big architecture firms have. They have massive, massive problems, and most of them are trying to get an idea into a drawing. Most of them are trying to solve something that they have here, that they may have modeled over here, but ultimately it has to get drawn. It has to get printed. It has to show up correctly in the construction drawings. That's the deliverable. Learned a lot about BIM management, learned a lot about time management, and I still kind of had my toe in the dRofus thing, and I still wanted to explore that further. And eventually I got promoted from being BIM manager in St. Louis to being asked to be on the corporate team. So stepping up into more of the technology leadership realm. And I was asked to move to New York. And I was like, sounds great. Talked to my wife. We're looking at Brooklyn. We're getting excited about moving to New York. And then at the very last moment, before we went to New York to go check out some apartments, I get called in by Patrick into his office. And he's like, I got James on the call. We need to talk through this. We think it's better if you move to San Francisco. So instantly, my wife and I are saying, wait, I don't want to go to San Francisco. I want to go to New York. New York is where we were going. Like I finally, from St. Louis to New York, you kind of mentally have transitioned and are preparing yourself. But
two opposite ends of the United States.
Totally opposite ends. But it made sense strategically because you've got James Van de Zan, you got Chris Zug, you've got Greg. All of the technology guys are in New York. But on the West Coast, you got Lee Miller, and you've got the CTO and the CEO. So they were like, it makes more sense for you to go to the West Coast so we can balance our skills and spread some of the technology wealth across the company. So the thought was, let's move Brok to San Francisco. We can have an extension from him on the technology side to help support Asia. It's really hard to go from London to Asia, but it's easy to go from New York to London. So it was kind of an idea of spreading some of the resources. Brok's going to focus on dRofus initially. And so I got to go full focus on one product. And if you are a technologist and you're working in a huge firm and you're able to say, I only am going to focus on one product and do it really, really well, create training material, create influencers throughout the company. I got to visit almost all the offices. I got to do tons and tons of training. And ultimately, when you do that central focus, I remember hearing stories of Phil Reed coming to St. Louis and teaching Revit. It was like, you get one person who's really, really good at one thing, and then you can spread the wealth. And then everyone's going to learn the right way, the right process with the right tool. And I was hooked. The more I got to use dRofus, the more I realized that I think the future is data management. As much as people were focusing on renderings and focusing on the beautiful aspect of design, I drank the Kool-Aid on the data side, and I knew that data was going to be the way to go. I got to meet Don Rudder out of the San Francisco office. So from a data standpoint, I'm realizing that data is actually the root of my true value and what I really wanted to do. I wasn't very good at drawing. I wasn't very good at modeling. I wasn't very good at design, but I could solve problems. And the idea of being a support role for people that are doing architecture, I felt comfortable with that. Ironically, I had gotten my license. I was a licensed architect when I took the job to move to San Francisco. I had literally just got my license in St. Louis. I still had my Missouri license on my desk. So I thought it was important to get that license, move to California, a few years out in California, focusing on dRofus implementation. And eventually I called Rolf and was like, I'd love to just come work for you guys. And Rolf's like, you know what? HOK is one of our best clients. why don't you stay there a little bit longer? Let's take care of HOK. Let's make sure they're happy. So we developed a plan. I worked with David Patera about the job opportunity, worked out with Greg and James. Essentially, I gave a good long notice. I think it was over a year notice, something like that. It was an extremely long notice. And we did a transition plan. And I eventually scaled back a lot of my responsibilities, disseminated those to other technologists throughout the company, and I developed a very clean transition plan. And when I started working for dRofus, I was actually doing a lot of the same things that I was doing when I was at HOK for HOK, but not as an HOK employee. And over the last 5 years, being able to do what I did for HOK for a whole lot more value to more firms still gives me that same joy that I had when I was at HOK, where I was a resource helping people get their job done. But now I'm able to do that for owners, engineers, architects, firms of all size and scale. I know how to talk to small firms because I worked at a small firm. I know how to talk to medium-sized firms, which honestly, at any large firm, every office is a medium-sized firm. And then knowing how global companies operate in the logistics and the politics and the management levels you have to deal with, all of it kind of transitioned to make sense to what I do today, where I get to focus on helping people get their job done. I tell people that I don't teach you how to drive. I teach you how to downshift into a turn and find your line. Yeah. Because to me, it's all about using the right tool the right way, not just using it. So I find myself more of a teacher, more of an educator, more of a coach than anything, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what fascinates me about this story. And if I kind of talk to colleagues that are in architecture, and I also look at, going back to the discussion earlier about, if you're a young person coming into the world of architecture and, picking up new things and figuring out ways of questioning why you're doing things a certain way, I think is critical to this. But there's always a hesitation, I feel, for folks to become too specialized around a subject. And people do get anxiety about going into a practice and becoming like the rendering person, or becoming the data person, even to some degree with like the stuff that we talk about often, which is like computational designer types of roles. I mean, I know plenty of really talented folks that are doing the computational design path, but they're also very anxious about losing a place in the kind of normal, I guess, career path of becoming a well-rounded architect. And what I often like to, highlight in this is that on the one hand, you could think about it in terms of becoming pigeonholed or becoming too specialized. And, but I also think that there's an aspect to the conversation around digital transformation, the use of digital tools when it comes to the general idea of mastery and understanding the craft of the tool. And to me, when you are describing how you started to really focus in on dRofus at HOK, and you built up this implementation plan, you learned the tool and the technology so well, some people would look at that and be like, oh, wow, you just became very specialized. But to me, it's also like, no, you mastered a subject. And I think a lot of architects could, in today's day and age where you have this wide variety of skill sets that you need, project management is a path. Becoming a design architect is a path. Becoming someone that is very well focused on technical sides of buildings is a path. Design technology is a path. There's an aspect of mastery to this, and I think firms would do well to look at how they can encourage their folks to become not just experts or specialists, but folks that know their subject matter so well that they are a resource, and is that's really where a firm, I think, can really see the benefits of a digital transformation is when they're looking at that. And it goes back to just the aspect of craft. I mean, when you were talking about Mylar drawings and people hand lettering and drafting,
Right.
yeah, there's always the old timers that say, like, back when we were doing drawings, everyone paid attention to this sort of line weight and the craft of putting together a drawing, and they kind of feel like some of that's been lost.
Sure.
In the space of Revit. Drawings don't look like the way they used to, and there's sort of maybe some digital messiness to them. It's not as clean, but the rules of craft, I feel, still apply. And I think even when you're dealing with a database like dRofus, and understanding how do you keep that data well structured, clean, reliable, and consistent, that's craft.
Sure.
And I feel like there's an aspect of just that firms that are looking at new tools need to kind of embrace a little bit more and think about it in terms of like architectural craft. That's what we're talking about at the end. What do you think?
Well, if the tool doesn't help you get your job done, you should stop using the tool. I mean, if I used a hammer to plant my shrubs, I could eventually get it to work, but I'm not using the right tool the most efficient way. So I think part of that is I should be a gardener. So from a skill set standpoint, I should learn from other gardeners. And if I learn from other gardeners, they're going to tell me that you need a spade here and you need a shovel here. And here's why. And let me show you the right methodologies. And I think many times people think of technologists, BIM managers, whatever the new title is for the role of someone who's in charge of the technology implementation for your firm. They see that person as a commodity in the accounting department, or they consider them the only person to fix things when they break. And I think where firms fail is when they rely on one person to be putting out all the fires, rather than empowering that person to actually be in a leadership role to teach everyone how to use the right tools and when to use those tools, and let them do things like decisions on buying software. Here's your budget. This is the things that we need you to accomplish. And if they sit down and do an ROI and they say, this little tool that costs this much, if we put it on every one of our machines, it will increase the efficiency using this task. That's a business logic, and it's someone that understands technology and how it affects the business. You can't just take a CAD manager who managed list routines in layers and throw them into that role. It is a role that has evolved over time as the technology has evolved. And so firms need those kinds of roles as well. And I personally think that firms that have been very successful implementing technology is because they've been thinking about those roles of technology leadership. And I think if you take the top 10 design firms out there, they have full-time people that aren't being asked to be billable in order to be effective at their job, because they're proving their value by distributing their resource across offices and across different projects through teaching and training, or even building tools in-house. And it's crazy that 15 years into this profession professionally, almost 18 when you think about the time I did before cutting grass, I think that there are aspects behind knowing who's in charge of your decisions in your firm when it comes to technology, and empowering those people that understand the tool to impact the process. But there's also a challenge on balancing your resources. I would hate to see a firm that's using all of their profit to pay for technology. You should not have to pay more for a piece of software than you can afford. And I think many times there's a threshold of, we're spending too much on technology. Well, if you're looking at it on a math standpoint, the most thing you're going to spend at a firm is your people, right? Sure. Their hourly rate is how you make your money, right?
That's where that's where the
thing that I think would be of most value is not looking at what you spend on technology. It's what your team is using to do their work, and distribute what they're doing for their work to the value that they're presenting to you with the tools they have. I remember a guy at HOK that worked on Revit projects by himself. He brought in those projects by himself and did all of the design work, all the modeling, all the drawing, and all the client meetings completely by himself. They probably made 400% profit on this guy because he was able to do it all by himself. But then you have other avenues where a piece of technology is going to be maybe super expensive. Remember how expensive printing was, where you would get charged per linear foot of drawings, right? But you would never say, we can't really do the printing next year because it's just costing too much. So I think there are times where technology should be treated more like a utility and less so as a punishment to the design team's choice. There should be freedom of choice within the team. If they want to use Rhino, they want to use Revit, they want to use Rhino inside, whatever the tools they want to use, as long as they're getting their job done, I think the investment should be there. But too many times I hear about one tool or one product being too expensive because they're looking at it on an annual basis as a line item versus the value it's giving across the design professionals. And you need that technologist in the room that's between the accounting department and your C-suite to help make those judgment decisions.
Yeah, well, I think, to go along with that, there is an aspect of business management and accountability process and understanding what those returns on investment actually are. And if I were to think about areas where firms are struggling with the expense of software, with the, and I'll say this, perceived expense of software, perceived expense of having specialists on staff, employing coders, which is now kind of increasingly a thing. People working on, inside of a firm, working on internal products, is now, fairly commonplace at some of the larger firms, certainly. But I think there's still some fundamental components of architecture and construction businesses in general. Everything's very driven by the project, and being a project services company is very different than being a product company, which you're now a part of, right? Where you're taking your profits from the current version of dRofus and reinvesting them back into the product, improving on it, taking it forward, and it keeps people subscribed. It keeps people reinvesting back into your product, which is very different than a services company where it's like, hey, I got this project. I'm going to use my process and procedures to get that project done, makes the money, then on to the next project. Somehow when it comes to like figuring out within the project and services context, if I bring in technology X, it allows me to do Y, that and investing in skills over here, this is going to justify this cost. But not a lot of firms, I feel like, have taken that step in a very rigorous and continuous manner within their business model, and it kind of creates this context where, in many firms, it's technology is thought of as this kind of expense. There hasn't really been a very, like in the world of BIM, and of course you've probably read the open letter to Autodesk.
Sure. And their response, you have to read them both.
And their response, for sure. To me, that letter spoke to a number of things, and I think one of them, there's an aspect of this where there are issues for sure, but there are some symptomatic components to that letter. And understanding where is the value of BIM in our process, and what is it actually getting us beyond just being a production tool.
Sure.
And it would be interesting to see more research done in this space. How does technology and the expertise around technology impact a business of architecture, in a way that goes beyond the profit multiplier, the utilization stats of, what is the productivity of the design workforce out there? Well, we haven't really done that.
The other thing to consider, and I've been thinking about this for almost my whole career, is the roles that we have in our profession that we defined long before you and I got into this business, have those roles changed? So if I wanted to make more money in this profession as a young professional, right now my career track is project manager. If I want to make more money, I should be a project manager. So in many cases, and this is just from my own personal experience and observation over the years, usually an architect that's not a very good architect becomes project managers. They realize that their skill is better suited to organizing people and plans and clients than on meeting drawing deadlines or focusing on a door schedule or doing a specification review. So they learn, I'm an architect, but I'm probably better at project management. So in many cases, we end up with people with project management roles who are managing time, who are managing resources, who are managing expectations and deadlines, who become very separated from the end product. They become separated from the process. They don't know how long it takes for something to actually be created. So it's not their own fault, but they become very distant from the work. And if you look at that from a hierarchy standpoint, if you want to make more money, you go from project manager to director. And those directors are another layer of separation from the work. And then you go to the C-suites. So then you have people at the executive level who are so far removed from the work that they didn't really see the value of going from hand drafting to CAD drawing. They didn't see the value from CAD drawing to 3D modeling. They don't understand the value of a Dynamo script or a dRofus API connection to Power BI. Like, they're so far removed that they don't understand those different nuances. And I feel like, going back to that role of the technologist, you need that person to connect the executives to the directors to the project managers downstream. And I think as an industry, when we're thinking about roles and we're thinking about deliverables, we still do schematic design, design development, CDs, and CA, and we're still managing time and expectations as if there's been no impact on the technology and the process. I would be interested to know, with the right tool, evaluating time spent on the effort as it correlates to deliverables. So instead of thinking of design as schematic design, DD, CDs, and construction administration, reverse engineer that process. Building is built. What's the most efficient way for us to get to here and work our way backwards? And we might actually need people in a design firm to have an expertise in fabrication. We might have people at a design firm understand cost management, to understand the difference between a triple glaze system versus a prefabricated triple glaze system versus not going triple glaze because it sounded interesting. You know, there's a cost modeling aspect. And I think the real art of the profession is thinking of a whole project on a continuum and being able to measure your effort throughout that process. I would consider the delivery of a building 100%. You give the keys to the client at 100%. And then you go all the way back to 0%. And there's a delivery of the project. 50% deliverable, you get 50% of your fee based on the construction cost. 25%, you get 25% of the construction cost. And if at any point along the line, you deliver the project earlier, you get paid out earlier. If the project actually increases in value, you actually get paid more. If you're able to save the client money, you actually are able to pocket that with some sort of profit-centric focus. If we actually change the whole process on how projects are delivered and built, you could actually see someone who's involved with fabrication get hired at 20% building deliverable to help design the facade system. And their fee of fabrication gets hit here, knowing that a year and a half later is when the construction of that fabrication is actually done. I think that would change the game completely.
I think, you know, what you're really talking about is the process change that, if you look at where technology is and the possibilities that exist within a data-centric workflow within the context of building information modeling, is, you know, we have these technologies that are coming in and they're being applied in a way that may slightly improve upon the current process. And, you know, Revit's a really prime example of this. Like you can make a really nice integrated information rich model, but the output that architects are leveraging it for, organizing your construction document sheets and producing essentially the same types of deliverables that have been in play for decades.
Right.
It's modification of the process. And what you're talking about, and this is where I can be, you know, critical perhaps of that, the architect's letter to Autodesk and sort of the dissatisfaction. Perhaps it's easy to point the finger at technology and tools, and I'm not saying there's not issues there.
Sure.
When it comes to like development and improvement on product and subscription and changing up licensing structures, there's problems there to address. But there's also a bit of businesses that are being presented with these tools also need to recognize the opportunity there is to evolve your business beyond the status quo.
Right.
And really think about, hey, if I have technology X and I have this, as you said, 100% delivered building over here,
right,
what's actually the best way to get to it? What do I need to think about in my contract structure? What
yes.
do I need to look at like some level of performance-based compensation? Why are we operating as a separate design entity from the fabricator on these elements? Why can't we be together? And we can cut shop drawings out in case and just go right to the machine. Like there are all these like cultural and process barriers that exist in practice that I feel organizations need to meet, basically meet the challenges that they're being faced with. And it's not technology necessarily that's going to save you. It's going to be, how are you going to overhaul your business?
Put pressure on your lawyers and your insurance companies.
Yeah.
If you're a design firm, to say, help us solve this. Because I mean, the truth is, one of the lawyers at HOK, I had a conversation with, he's since left the firm. I had a conversation with him and I said, is there any chance that projects that use dRofus would have a lower liability? Therefore, the insurance in those projects could actually get reduced.
Right.
Because you're tracking every single change when it relates to the program. And if we're linking that to a Revit database and we're actually using logs to track changes in Revit, could that project actually have a lower liability insurance? And if we did this across all the projects, could you argue that the whole firm's insurance their premiums should go down?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, like those are transformative arguments to be making. And oftentimes we hear, and you know, I've personally observed anxiety around those issues. You know, we were Proving Ground. We were a part of kind of a major project, and one of the questions is a complex geometry. You need to digitally fabricate it in order to get the geometry resolved and correct. Sure. There was anxiety about giving a fabricator a model. And I'm like, well, you're not going to get this thing built with your drawings that you're crunching out of Revit. You're going to need to give them the Rhino model. And they're like, well, how do we address? I'm like, I'm not saying how you address it from a liability standpoint.
Yeah.
You want this done. These are the digital assets that are going to allow you to do it in the best way possible. Right. So if you then have to backfill in and think about, wow, do we need to think about a new type of contract here? Do we need to like think about the business relationship a little bit more? Yeah. That's where the real transformation is going to occur. And yes, you do, by the way.
Yes, you do.
Unless you want to play.
We should be putting pressure on the. Well, I mean, lawyers are probably the highest paid in our industry. If you had an architecture firm and there's a lawyer, trust me, they're charging more hourly than the architects are.
Sure.
And I honestly think that the more effort they put in now in thinking about those things, that's where their time is best spent, not in litigation, not trying to get money back that was lost on a project that had a failure, but on the preventative side. We need more lawyers writing contracts for design firms that are more preventative measures, protecting them so that they can take more risks, so that the design can actually be freed up and the process can be freed up. And the protective aspects, I think the thing that is really unfair is there's been so few litigation related to BIM that it shouldn't be the fear factor. There's still more litigation about competency and doing things wrong in a 2D drawing environment that probably could have been avoided if they actually did model these things, or if they did manage the data in a different way. That I would argue that if more time is spent pushing design forward and pushing the process forward, if we take that 100% measure of a project and we use the old Patrick McLeamy effort curve, and we truly think about the delivery of a project with time and effort, if we did put more time and effort earlier in the process and compensated for it, I think architecture firms could change their whole business model. If they're actually getting paid based on the value of the building and the delivery of the project versus an hourly rate that was managed by the 70s AIA contracts of the days. And think about the cohesive delivery. And I'm not talking about the P3 projects kind of aspects. I'm just saying at the very get-go, client says, I have this much money, this is what I want. You plan out what that means, and then you define a delivery process based on that specific project need. I think architects could make more money if they're delivering along those means. But to make more money, you have to take more risk. You might have to get more lawyers writing better contracts for you.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of risk is always interesting. And in a lot of ways, I think it's perceived risk. Because to me, it seems like the risk is doing it by the status quo. Like if anything, like technology and the types of insights that you can glean from your tools, and also kind of enable certain capabilities related to coordination, conflict resolution, that's de-risking a process. And those are mechanisms. Like if I think about what dRofus does, right? It's data management. You're creating consistency of, you're creating a centralized database that equips a designer with the ability to inject their model with that consistent data, verify their model against project requirements, and ideally improve the outcome of delivering a project that has good data and is correct with the performa of the project. That's de-risking a project. And it's taking, how would you, and if you would do it the old way, it's going to be time consuming, laborious, and you're going to burn through your fee. So that to me starts to, the story of dRofus and what it does is actually a great example of
if you don't plan your work, then you're not going to end up with the right results.
Yeah.
And then if you work on your results and you have no validating that it was what you intended to build, how do you know if what you build is right?
Yep. Well, we went over an hour. We're now at an hour and a half.
Hey, it's your job as editor to figure out how to get this.
No, I won't. So here's the thing with
your commercial time slot.
There is very little editing that goes into this. And I thought the conversation here is great. You touched on your path, which I think is really important for folks. Folks that listen to the channel. They're going to be all over the spectrum when it comes to where they are at their career. A lot of young folks listening to this, so hearing this sort of reflections of how you got into the business of architecture and then ended up in the role that you're in is really good stuff to hear. Do you have any parting thoughts or words of wisdom to someone that maybe taking it all the way back, maybe just starting out in the space of architecture, may have an inclination to pursue a technology course or a technology course of action in their career? What would you recommend to them? Like, number one recommendation?
Number one recommendation is never stop asking questions. I think the path that people project on people is, think of it as a hiking path. You must go this way. But really, architecture is walking on the beach. There are people you can follow, but there's no reason why you can't take a different path to get to the same point. There are aspects of walking on the beach that if you stray too far, you get in the water and you come back. And it taking a risk of actually...
Or you might learn to surf and do something completely different entirely, right?
You might just find out that you should be on the water and you end up getting on a boat. You're right. But the path of what you want, you won't know until you start walking. But if you go quicker, you might find a correction to that path sooner. So I find many people that have sat on things they wish they did for way too long. And then they get to a point in their career where they're in the woods and they only have the option of walking on the paved path. Yeah. I would suggest while you're young to explore various options, teach yourself new tools constantly, ask tons of questions, go to conferences that seem like they're not the right conferences to attend, watch the YouTube videos that seem on the edge. And the biggest thing that we didn't have when we were younger is the ability to follow people that we want to learn from. I wish I had Twitter and LinkedIn and other things back in the day, because if you target the right people in your social media feed and you use it as a way of bettering yourself, you can actually use the following actions of people that are innovative and are leaders in the industry as a guide. And that's the secret behind why I'm on Twitter and why I'm on LinkedIn. I do not use it the way you would use Instagram or Facebook. My Twitter feed is literally filtered for people that I'm trying to learn from. And my LinkedIn following list is people that I'm trying to connect with because I want to learn more from them. And honestly, how we got to this podcast was because we're connected on LinkedIn. We started a DM. We jumped into a Zoom call. We continued the conversation. So technology is actually making it so much easier to have that quick connectivity, that if you're not leveraging these tools this way, if you're not building your brand and your network and bettering yourself professionally, then you're just going to get the career path that's on the wooded path that everyone else is taking. And for a lot of people, that's fine. A 9-to-5 job where you take your lunch break every noon time. A lot of people have long, successful careers on that path. The last little tidbit, one of my favorite quotes, Paul Minardo is the guy I worked with when I was young at John Gramigna Architects. He was one of the other partners in that firm. He said, the key to organization is retrieval. And at that time, he was talking about his Rolodex because he was getting a name for me to call. But that still holds true today, that if you have an organized social media life, an organized email life, an organized way of working within your system, then when you have that moment, oh yeah, that podcast or that Twitter feed, using those means of organizing and saving those and putting them in the bucket or the Trello board or whatever that you use to organize, the key to organization is retrieval. That's the thing that I think I've lived my professional life by. And I would suggest everyone try to keep some of those things, some of those value propositions in their day-to-day action, and they'll actually find improvements in their day-to-day work.
Love it. Great. Well, that's awesome. And for folks that are tuning in and watching this podcast. Brok and I are in the midst of thinking through a webinar type of scenario, which will be much more technically oriented, looking
Right.
at the intersection between dRofus, Revit data, and some of the tools that we're making with data for data visualization, tracer, and so on. Still working through those details, but you know, we'll keep you posted on all of that. And thanks Brok for doing this. And and just to kind of maybe build on your last point there, one of the reasons I love doing these podcasts, and I'm now kind of making a more deliberate effort to get back on the horse, so to speak, because we've taken a bit of a break, is, you know, learning from people that we have on, and figuring out ways of communicating with industry colleagues where I can hopefully give a platform for folks like Brok, you, to tell your story, and then I can like kind of learn from that as well, and, you know, take that into the work that we're doing. So awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. See you, man.
Cheers.